right, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. I'm super excited to introduce Mimi Liljeholm today. Mimi comes to us from just on the road at UCI, where she's an associate professor of cognitive sciences. She did her training at one of the absolute best institutes for neuroscience and psychology in the entire world, UCLA. She did her undergraduate work here. She got her Ph.D. here with Patricia Chang. She did a postdoc here with Bernard Belain, which is where I met her. And then she went on to do another postdoc with John O'Doherty across both Trinity College in Dublin, as well as Caltech. Throughout her training, Mimi started working with human subjects, and then she went to rodent subjects and then back again, which I think lends a really unique perspective to her work and also accounts for part of its wide-ranging impact. So Mimi understands how learning and decision-making occurs in multiple different species. Her lab is really interested in understanding how we learn and represent the structure of our environments, and then use this information to inform how we perceive, how we think, and how we behave. She's tackling these questions with a very broad and multifaceted approach that includes things like neuroimaging, economic theories, as well as computational modeling. Because she's studying some of the most fundamental processes that control our everyday adaptive as well as maladaptive behaviors, her work has been impactful to a variety of fields, and of course, not surprisingly, is very well funded, and her lab has been really quite productive. I think we'll have a nice chance today to see Mimi's unique perspective, her super creative questions and experimental designs and analysis approaches as she tells us about how we learn actions to control our environment. Thanks so much, Mimi.
Thank you, Kate, for that lovely introduction. And thank you for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here. Good to be back. What does it mean to control your environment, and why is it important? As an illustration, let's imagine, oh, this thing doesn't work actually. Here it is. Let's imagine that you're buying a soda vending machine for your lab space. So you go to the soda vending machine store down the street, and you see this one looking pretty good. You know, you put in $1, you press this top button, you get a Coke, press this bottom one, you get a Sprite. Fair enough? Okay, now I have to remember that it's that one. Here's another one, almost identical, except only one button is available at any given point. So right now it's the Sprite button. So put in $1, you have to push that Sprite button and you get a Sprite, and then the machine flips over. And now if you put in $1, you can get a Coke, and it flips over again, and so on and so forth. Let's imagine too that as you are contemplating which of these machines to get, your desire for Coke is exactly the same as your desire for Sprite. You value them equally. If that's the case, then normative theories of goal-directed choice, whether it's rational choice theory or model-based reinforcement learning, because they equate the expected utility of a decision, or of a vending machine in this case, with the probabilities and subjective utilities of the decision outcomes, they would say that these two machines are equally valuable to you, right? When the utilities are the same, the probabilities don't. So these theories would say that these machines are equally valuable, really. Oh, but now I'm going to destroy the ears of the people who are actually in the room. Are you okay? Tell me to tone it down if I need to. And I have to hold this thing. Okay. We know from lots of research that, you know, animals from humans to pigeons prefer, all else being equal, to have free choice. And an intuitive explanation for that free choice preference is that, hi, Chris. Even though right now you like Sprite and Coke exactly the same, chances are that will change, because the subjective utilities of natural rewards are constantly fluctuating based on hedonic and homeostatic principles. So only when you have free choice do you have this opportunity to switch between actions to produce the sensory specific outcomes that you want the most at that particular moment, right? Now, as far as this equation goes, we can just add the probability and subjective utility of free choice to the equation. Of course, by doing that, now we're saying that these two machines should have the same value because they both have free choice. Down here, it's totally up to you if you want the top one or the bottom one. And remember that all these sodas are worth the same, so that doesn't matter. But we actually also know from research that at least humans prefer to have some variability in the sensory features of decision outcomes. And this has been interpreted as kind of, don't put all your eggs in one basket, diversify your portfolio, those kinds of things. So again, we could just add now the probability and subjective utility of outcome variability to our equation. But by adding these, assuming a linear relationship, we're predicting that the value of free choice will be the same whether you have outcome variability or not, and vice versa. And maybe that's true, but it's not consistent with that intuition we had about why you like free choice in the first place. It's still the case that only with this machine can you use your actions to switch outcome states according to your fluctuating preferences. I'm going to put this one. I can't have that many things in my hands. Let's see. So maybe what you like is not free choice and outcome variability, but you like free choice induced outcome variability. That's a mouthful, so I'm going to call it instrumental divergence. Conceptually, instrumental divergence is really just how different available actions are with respect to their outcome distributions. And when we have, two buttons and a Sprite and a Coke, it's very easy to say, well, here, there's a lot of instrumental divergence. These two buttons have very different outcomes. But that's because we know about Sprite and Coke and we have those different colors. Let's not focus so much on the look of the can. In reality, the two sodas have, a list of ingredients with different magnitudes. And now it's not as easy at a glance to just say how similar or different these outcomes are, right? So if we want to formally quantify it, we can turn these kind of frequency or magnitude distributions into probability distributions. And then we can use information theory to compute the distance between the distributions. If you are familiar with information theory, then you can see that this is the Jensen-Shannon distance. It's a symmetrized and smoothed version of the famous Kullback-Leibler distance. Instead of going from one probability distribution to another, like we do with the Kelly distance, we're going from each distribution to their mean. So it's kind of like an absolute distance, just like you would have an absolute difference. If you're not into information theory, don't worry about it. All you really need to know is that we use this equation to quantify how similar outcome distributions are, right? How similar or different are these two distributions? Now we have a value for that we get from this information theoretic equation. And once we have that, we can plug that into our utility equation. Why do we need the utility equation? Well, we don't always, but there are a lot of reasons to formalize these value signals. One is that it allows us to take different psychological constructs like instrumental divergence, free choice, and integrate them into a single utility signal. It also allows us to pit those against objective currencies like money. What's the trade-off between these intrinsic motivation constructs and money? And once we have this formalized, we can implement it in a computer and do a bunch of simulations, so we're not as limited with data points. And also, of course, we can take this integrated signal and we can regress it against a continuous dependent measure like a bold signal. So we're going to do all of that, but in general, I would say, and certainly for now, it's fine to just focus on this concept of instrumental divergence. How different are the outcomes of different actions? So let's have a look at that first. In this experiment, we told subjects that they were gamblers in a casino. They were going to be choosing between gambling options, but before they could do that, at the beginning of each gambling round, they had to choose which room to gamble in. So these are the gambling, the gambling options are just labeled A1 through A4. Each has a probability distribution over 3 different colored token outcomes, and those token outcomes are worth different amounts of money. So as you can see, there's only 2 different distributions. It's actually the same probabilities, just reversed. So it's easy to combine these gambling options into pairs that either have high or low divergence. Again, here, you don't need information theory to see that these 2 actions or gambling options have different distributions over those outcomes, and these 2 are identical. So we pre-train these probabilities, and then we also are going to manipulate outcome variability using these self-play and autoplay labels. So in each round, participant is told you have to select the room to gamble in. You know what the gambling options are in that particular room. You know if once you're in the room, you get to choose between options or the computer is just going to alternate for you. So we call that self-play and autoplay. And we do that because, first of all, it introduces this free choice variable, but also when you're in an autoplay room, the outcome variability is the same as in a self-play room. It's actually maximized in autoplay rooms, but there's no instrumental divergence because if you don't get to choose, it's not instrumental. So it kind of controls for outcome variability as well. So you see this choice screen, you pick a room, now you get into that room, and now you get to see the monetary values of the tokens. But and so, you pick a gamble, you get some token outcome, you do this for a few trials, then you're kicked back out and you have to choose a new room to gamble in. And it's really this room decision, this decision about what environment you want to be gambling in that we're interested in. The token probabilities, as I said, are fixed and they're trained to accuracy before they start the task, but the monetary values change intermittently and they know that's going to happen. And it always happens after you pick a room. So every time you make one of those room choices, you do it knowing that the monetary values of the token can change at any time. So this is kind of the categorical comparison that I was talking about. We have here a proportion of choosing the high divergence room over the 0 divergence room when that room is autoplay versus when it's self-play. And you can see here that there is no preference for high divergence when it's autoplay, then that just equals outcome variability. Actually, we usually still see some preference here, but there's always a much greater preference for high divergence when it's self-play. And that's, of course, when it is instrumental divergence. We can also look at self-play choices, and we see here that the preference for self-play is much greater when you have high divergence. Again, when you have 0 divergence, self-play just means you can decide which option to select, but it doesn't matter because the outcome distributions are identical. So it's kind of free choice versus meaningful choice. Let's, as promised, plug these variables into a utility signal so that then we can use that to predict neural activity. So conventionally, we would just have the probability of a particular token outcome given the gamble times the monetary value of that token outcome, which does change here, but that's your basic expected utility equation. Here we can add the instrumental divergence of the room that you're going to gamble in to account for the room choice. Or we could just focus on that expected monetary value. This is a policy model. It doesn't care about instrumental divergence, but it does weigh the monetary payoff expectation with how greedy you are, that is how likely you are to pick the best gambling option, just to make sure that preferences for instrumental divergence don't reflect kind of reward maximization in a way that zero divergence room wouldn't allow for. So what I'm showing you here, we have these models. All I'm doing here is we take these values. So this is expected value with instrumental divergence, expected value if you are greedy and reward maximize, but without divergence. And then here we have just normal expected value, the probability and current value of the token outcomes. And this is the choice probability generated by that instrumental divergence expected value model. So we just put those values through a softmax to generate choice probabilities. So this is the probability of making a left choice, like whatever was on the left side of the screen. According to that instrumental divergence expected value model, I'm also showing that those model probabilities in blue here, just to see, of course, that's going to be linear, but just so you can see how the behavior overlaps, it's pretty close. Behavior is in red, and you see the pure payoff and the policy models don't do as well. This is all for instances where the room on the left side was self-play or had non-zero divergence. When the room, either both rooms have zero divergence or both rooms are autoplay, this model no longer outperforms the other models. Again, then you don't really have any agency. You don't have any flexible instrumental control. You stop caring about instrumental divergence. Any questions? So as promised, once we have these signals, we can regress them against bold to see where in the brain things are being computed. I'm going to tell you quickly what you're looking at here. You have these are contrast weights, so it's basically the beta coefficient on that particular regressor on the expected values generated by the instrumental divergence model, by the policy model, by the payoff model, and so forth. So each of those models is a regressor in a general linear model, just a time series, and then we're looking at neural activity. And so this is actually an ROI analysis. And again, we're looking at when the rooms are self-play or have high divergence, so it's actually instrumental, versus when they're autoplay or zero divergence, and then everything kind of collapses. This is an ROI analysis in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and we did that because it's an area that's kind of known for encoding value across a range of commodities and currencies. So you can integrate, food and toys and trinkets and get this single value signal in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And here we're showing basically that this extends to more abstract commodities like instrumental divergence, more abstract cognitive motivational constructs. We also see very similar effects in the rostrolateral prefrontal cortex. This is a whole brain corrected exploratory analysis. It does kind of make sense, but I'm not going to post hoc rationalize it because it wasn't an ROI. We didn't expect to see it. If you're familiar with this region, you might not be shocked to see it pop up here, but going forward, we'll look closer at that. What I really want to talk about is this area right here. This is the right supramarginal gyrus of the parietal lobe. And what we see here is that the extent to which neural activity in this region is modulated by the instrumental divergence value model, that predicts the influence of that model on behavioral choices. The reason that I'm interested in this region is because, when you do fMRI, you always have to be a little bit skeptical. You want to see things pop up a few times before you put a lot of stock in it. And this region really does pop up a lot in these studies. This is an experiment that I did in 2013 with John. So here on each trial, you just see two action alternatives, and you see two treats potentially produced by those actions. Again, you've kind of learn these probabilities ahead of time. And you pick an action and you might get a treat. We tell people not to eat before they come in, so they're incentivized. But here we actually found, and so again, there's going to be some instrumental divergence. These actions that are available on this trial could have the same distribution over the available outcomes, or they could have very different distributions. And we found that activity in the right supramarginal gyrus tracked instrumental divergence across trials in this task. And that signal was dissociable from other information theoretic measures like entropy, which is basically the uniformity of the distribution, and also other motivational signals like the expected utility just in terms of the food outcome. So here's that region again, tracking instrumental divergence. Here's another study, very complicated. I'm going to spare you the details of this, but essentially subjects have to regulate a set of fluid-filled beakers using response sequences. And this is within condition. In one condition, each time the liquid drops in a beaker, a cue comes up, and the identity of that cue tells you what sequence you have to perform to fill up the beaker. In the high divergence condition, every action fills up a specific beaker. So if I see that, beaker 1 is empty, then I perform this action. That means that every action maps on to a specific sensory outcome. And what we actually found here behaviorally was that when we did an outcome devaluation procedure, participants were more devaluation sensitive in the high divergence condition. I'll come back to that, but for now, I just want to show that across acquisitions of blocks of acquiring these relationships, we see an increase in the supramarginal gyrus in this high divergence condition as you're learning these contingencies, but we don't see that in the zero divergence condition. And again, discriminatory activity in the right supramarginal gyrus, that is, the more activity in this region discriminates between these conditions, the more devaluation sensitive you are in the high divergence condition. So just to recap on that, bold activity in the right supramarginal gyrus scales with instrumental divergence and predicts the influence of instrumental divergence on choice performance and devaluation sensitivity. This is a region that has been heavily implicated in agency attribution and the sense of agency. So I don't want to offend anyone. If you study agency and you don't think flexible instrumental control is agency, we can talk about that later. For now, let's assume they're the same. I don't have to do this caveat each time, but I have a paper where I kind of do that mapping. And if you disagree, we can talk about it. But for now, let's just say that, having agency is like having flexible instrumental control. If we assume that, then there's a very rich literature on the sense of agency that has implicated the right supramarginal gyrus specifically. It's also functionally connected to the caudate, which is where we believe that goal-directed action values are stored, implemented. So that also makes sense in terms of how it might mediate these utility of agency computations. Just some thoughts on that. Now, I'm not saying that, in your supramarginal gyrus, you have this little Claude Shannon information theorist who's sitting there and doing information theory on a whiteboard. This is a computational level account, as we say, this information theoretic distance. But as it turns out, and this certainly isn't always the case, but things work out pretty nicely with this. Let's get back to this soda, outcome distribution. You have your two buttons. Let's say that these were the two distributions of just kind of the amount of ingredients for these different sodas. And let's say, I bought a soda, I let you have a drop, and I said, it has a lot of corn syrup. And then I asked you, which action did I perform? What would you say? Which button did I press? I just got a soda and it has a lot of corn syrup. The top one, yeah, the top button, exactly. So, and we could do that for all these outcomes. What this means is that actually the greater that information theoretic distance between distributions, the easier it is to classify an action based on its outcome. In fact, mathematically, the information theoretic, specifically the Jensen-Shannon distance, is equal to the mutual information. The Jensen-Shannon distance between these two outcome distributions is equal to the mutual information between the action and outcome variable. Mutual information is like correlation, but for qualitative variables or for any variable. It's a measure of how much knowing the state of one variable tells you about another variable. The reason it's cool that these things map on is because mutual information is a great classification accuracy indicator. So I was saying, sometimes when we have kind of computational level accounts, there's no feasible way to even map that to a neural implementation, but it would be very easy to implement instrumental divergence in a neural network for this reason. And so the conjecture is that something like that might be going on in the inferior parietal lobe. That's kind of it for the neuroscience part, you guys. I'm sorry. I'll get back to it a little bit. But for now, let me clean some of the stuff up from that first experiment. I told you in that first experiment, we had to train people up in advance. They had to learn these probability distributions, and that was very difficult. And so we could only have like 3 different probabilities. It's better if you can if you can show the probability distributions, right? So in this experiment, we're using pie charts to show you the distributions. Otherwise, the task is the same. You're a gambler in a casino. You have to choose first before each round of gambling which room you're going to play in. The rooms can be self-play or auto-play. And this time, and you always have 2 gambling options in each room, but this time you can actually see the distribution over outcomes for each gambling option. That means we can use more distributions. We can get more variance in this variable. Another point that I wanted to make is that, information theoretic distance has worked really well. Its relationship to mutual information is beautiful, but I'm not married to that at all. I use math as a tool to generate predictions. And so I'm completely open to the possibility that the information theoretic distance between outcome distributions doesn't always map on to the psychological construct of instrumental divergence. So an example where I thought in particular that might be the case is if we're comparing, for example, this room choice scenario, you're choosing between these 2 rooms. Here, the information theoretic distance, I'm going to say IT distance, is 0 because these 2 distributions are identical, right? And here, it's actually still very low. It's 0.04 nats, depends on what log base you use. Don't worry about it. But so this is how we quantify it. So 0 versus 0.04, both very low, one slightly greater than the other. Let's compare that to this room choice scenario. Here, they actually both have high information theoretic distance because they're very different. Like this is mostly green and this is mostly blue, very different. And then here, they're also very different. And again, it's 0.15, 0.2, so 0.05 difference, right? If we were going just by the information theoretic distance, if anything, it should be this one. And, your preference for this room over that one should be greater here than here, if anything, because the difference in the IT distance is bigger. But notice how up here, when you're comparing room 2 to room 1, room 2 has this unique feature, which is that you can completely avoid red, right? And imagine that red could be like, well, it could be death, could be anything, right? There are situations where that opportunity to completely avoid an outcome might be more important when you think about how different actions are. Information theory and probability theory in general doesn't care about stuff like that, right? So based on IT distance, we're going to say that if anything, your preference for room 2 is, greater on the bottom. But I'm going to guess that especially if these outcomes are potentially associated with loss, that you might have a greater preference in the top panel. Okay, the final thing that I wanted to address with this particular study was just, who values high instrumental divergence? We clearly see individual differences kind of in the subjective utility of instrumental divergence. Some of those individual differences were predicted by differences in neural activity in the right SMG, right? But we could also speculate that different populations are different with respect to how much they value flexible instrumental control, aka instrumental divergence, aka agency. So one thing we know very well is that schizophrenia, and in particular positive symptoms of schizophrenia, is associated with kind of a dysregulated sense of agency. It's very hard to get patient populations, as you all know. So what we tend to do is we use these dimensional measures. So schizotypy is like a set of personality traits that mimic and are somewhat predictive of the clinical symptoms of schizophrenia. So we can take neurotypical individuals and assess their degree of positive schizotypy and see how that scales with their preference for greater instrumental divergence, greater flexible instrumental control. Otherwise, the task is kind of like the one I showed you before. You know, you're first at the beginning of each round, you're shown 2 rooms, you have to pick one to gamble in. You can see in this particular study what the distributions are for each gambling option. You know if it's self-play or autoplay. In this one, people are actually told that the monetary values of these color outcomes are randomly generated on each trial. Actually, you might wonder, why is it so important for me to throw out the monetary value? Why am I stressing sensory features? It's because I'm really, where I'm going with this is really, you know, to the claim or speculation that instrumental divergence is kind of a general principle of organizing the state and action space. And you don't want to base that on utilities because, as I mentioned, subjective utilities are always changing. If things are the same or different in terms of value right now, that won't be the case in 2 hours. So you don't want to hang your hat on something as volatile as subjective utility. So again, this is kind of a categorical comparison. So what I'm showing here is that the preference for the greater divergence option is much bigger here. So the preference for this room over this room is much greater than the preference for this room over this room, just like we were kind of predicting, because here both rooms afford the opportunity to completely avoid red. But when these are the rooms you have to choose between up there, only one room allows you to do that. I forgot to mention, but here we tell people that the monetary values of the token will range from -3 to 3. So they know that there is a potential loss. Also, this difference in preference is not as pronounced or even significant when the rooms are autoplay. Again, identifying the instrumental component. Okay, this time we're going to just implement models so that we could do some simulation, so we can look at more data and we can look at optimality a little bit. But for now, red is behavior. What I'm showing here is, you know, the information theoretic distance associated with the room, 0.04, 0.15, 0.2, and then whether the room was self-play or autoplay. And then let's just quantify some of these intuitions we have about what might matter. All of these models are going to consider the experienced payoff in a room. Even if we tell people that the monetary values of the tokens will change all the time, they still kind of remember what they earned the last time they were in a room. They care about it and they integrate it into their decisions. So this is just kind of an updating rule where you're tracking how much money did I earn in the past in this room. And then of course we have our self-play model. So this is a model where in addition to the expected payoff, we're adding whether the room is self-play or not, P is 1 or 0, weighted by gamma, which here is just like a free parameter that reflects individual differences in the subjective utility of free choice. We have our information theoretic distance model where we also adding that term. So just like we were doing before, but I have a third model here and you can see how these are color coded in terms of the predictions. So the self-play model in green here only cares about whether it's self-play or autoplay. It doesn't care about instrumental divergence. And it's also within self-play and autoplay conditions, it actually shows you just the expected monetary values. And you can see how we've kind of pitted them a little bit against instrumental divergence. So actually, the greater the instrumental divergence, the lower the monetary payoff. Very subtle, but just to make sure we're on the right side of that. Now, remember us saying that when an outcome can be really aversive and you want to avoid it, you can look at instrumental divergence, or you can compute the information theoretic distance to see, how much control am I going to have in this environment? And what we're doing here, when we plug it into the equation, is we treat it as a reward surrogate. We come up with a way to quantify instrumental control, and then we plug it into the utility equation as if it was a reward. But another way you can do this is you can think ahead. When you make that room decision, you can think, because you know the values are changing, you can think, well, what if red was negative 100? We tell them it's negative 3 to 3, but what if red is the one that's negative 3? What if green is the one? You can loop through all of the different possible utilities of things and compute expected values based on that. So that's what this forward model does. All it does is it considers a range of possible token values within this range that we told participants. You could, lose $3 to gain $3, increment by 1. And then it computes the expected value of a room for all of those different values, assuming that you're going to pick the highest valued gambling option. So here we're actually not representing instrumental divergence explicitly. It's kind of tacit in our reward maximization because we're considering the possibility of utilities changing. It's kind of weird that people don't do this. Even in economics, again, rational choice theory, which is basically model-based reinforcement learning, it's such a fundamental equation that people always refer to, but it actually doesn't account for the fact that subjective utilities change. This is a forward model that takes into account the fact that utilities can change and can even be negative. And that is actually the model that fits behavior the best in this experiment. Yes. Good eye. As it turns out, the likelihood, so we fit these models again by plugging these values into a softmax that translate values into choice probability. And then we try to minimize the negative log likelihood of observed behavioral decisions. And that likelihood, that negative log likelihood, is actually the same for the IT and forward model. But because the forward model doesn't have a free parameter, it is better once we penalize. Yeah. So it actually doesn't, it's parameter free, it's better. And that might be why it performs better. I think in general, I'm not reading into this, so I think I have it here. But actually, another thing that's cool is that now, like I said, why do we need these equations? Well, part of why we want to do it is because we only have so much behavioral data, but once we formalize these value signals, we can simulate them. So here we're simulating 1,000 gamblers, each playing 1,000 rounds. And it turns out this forward model is also reward maximizing relative to the other ones. So it's optimal compared to the ones that we are testing. It's a relative fit. So there might be better ones, but in terms of the ones that we've implemented, it is, normative essentially. It could be that it's because we were using negative outcomes, right? That when you have the possibility of an aversive outcome, then you really prioritize the ability to completely avoid outcomes over flexible control in general. So I'm not throwing the IT distance out or something like it, the neural network classifier, those kind of pure measures of kind of flexible control. They have an advantage. First of all, they're computationally more tractable because you just compute the instrumental divergence or the IT distance, and then you can store it. You can even cache that, right? And just retrieve it for that environment. And it can rule out the need for an extensive tree search. If you look at the information theoretic distance between outcome distributions associated with available action alternatives, and you find that those are identical, you don't really have to go beyond that, right? If they have identical sensory specific outcome distributions, they're going to have identical values. Please save yourself that like 10-step tree search, like down to what am I going to do next week, if your action produces identical states. You don't have to make that plan until later at the very least. So there are a lot of advantages still. It's also possible that different models fit different populations. I'm not going to do that here, but that's another reason why we do the computational modeling, because we can have kind of population specific parameters. We can assess whether certain individuals value, instrumental divergence differently. And in fact, remember that with schizotypy, that's something that we really expect. So let's have a quick look at that, because we know that schizophrenia is associated with a dysregulated sense of agency. In fact, these dysregulations have been mapped to the right supramarginal gyrus. In addiction, we're also interested in addiction, and this might be more of a philosophical or ethical point, but there's still a raging debate about whether addiction is purely a disease or a choice, right? Is it a choice behavior? Do you have agency over your addiction? And I'm sure you know that depression was like defined essentially by a lack of agency. The learned helplessness theory of depression is essentially this idea that the inability to escape pain produces this apathy where you stop exploring your environment altogether. And there's a lot of dysregulated action outcome learning also in depression. So we have lots of reason. I mean, you can't be interested basically in agency or flexible instrumental control and not wonder what's going to happen in these different populations. So I'm not going to just like go look at every population, but we're going to do a little bit. In that initial experiment, as I told you, we were measuring schizotypy, and the positive schizotypy score in particular, which is unusual experiences, hallucinations, delusions, really predict the preference for free choice. I don't know if that's been shown before, but what we're specifically interested here is instrumental divergence. And it turns out that the positive schizotypy score is negatively correlated with the preference for really high divergence self-play, and positively correlated with zero divergence autoplay. So we could look at all of these conditions, but these are basically the two extreme conditions, the greatest agency that you can have in the experiment up there and the least, and we see these positive and negative correlations. So that's interesting to us. We are going to look at a couple of other populations. This is a sample of individuals with traumatic brain injury, all of whom have frontal lobe damage. And first of all, it's kind of interesting to see, so red is still the neurotypicals from the previous experiment. They're not matched controls, but you can see here that actually the individuals with traumatic brain injury are kind of tracking the neurotypicals in terms of the shape of this function, but they don't have actually a significant difference between self-play and autoplay. So it's like they care less about free choice than apparently instrumental divergence or outcome variability. They also show a pattern similar to the schizotypy individuals, where the severity of the TBI is negatively correlated with choosing this, greatest IT distant self-play, the kind of greatest agency condition, and positively correlated with choosing the least agency condition. So certainly with the schizotypy individuals, the way to think about that, because schizophrenia and positive symptoms are usually associated with an over-attribution of agency. And if that's the case here too, we can say that like, if you already think you have agency, even when you don't, then conditions with true instrumental control may be less enticing to you because you think you run everything, you're controlling everything. And by the same token, conditions that have no instrumental control may not be so aversive to you because you actually feel like you are making a difference even when you're not. That's a possibility. I'm not sure why individuals with TBI would look the same. One thing that's really important when you're looking at patients is to have a control where you don't see the effect. And actually, we don't see any relationship between TBI severity and reward maximization. So it's not that these individuals are just kind of like out of it, and so they're not able to do the task. The severity of their TBI does not predict their ability to make money in the task. It only predicts their preference for kind of flexible instrumental control. We actually see something similar with substance users in terms of these correlations. This is interesting though. So there's only 20 individuals in the substance use group. I shouldn't even be showing you this, but I couldn't help myself. If we look at alcoholism only, so they are going through and kind of indicating the severity of their addiction to various substances. If we look at alcohol, it looks a lot actually like the schizotypy did in terms of the correlations, and also no relationship with reward maximization. One thing that's really interesting, to the extent that we can read anything into this small sample, is that the severity of opioid addiction had the opposite. So they actually seem to crave instrumental control. They look the opposite. And surprisingly, psychostimulants didn't show any effect. And that was weird because we kind of expected, the severity of psychostimulant substance use to mimic schizotypy, but that's not what came out. Again, not enough data to say anything conclusive. But I think it's exciting. The positive schizotypy effect is robust. I've done that in other experiments as well. So it's kind of consistent with over-attribution effects seen with schizophrenia and agency. And we do see these effects in individuals with TBI and drug dependence that I just described. Wow. I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to say, but ask me later. I don't know. I can't say a lot about these like small samples of addicted individuals. I don't know what it means, and I'm interested. I know that much, but I do have actually an intuition about instrumental divergence and addiction. I'll do it really fast. I'll just say this, because I smoked cigarettes forever. The people who knew me when I was here for all those years, they don't even recognize me because I used to have a cigarette sticking out of my mouth and a big cloud of cigarette smoke in front of my face. So I know something about addiction. And I can tell you that when you're an addict and you're craving your drug and you haven't had it, it's kind of the only thing you think about. The scent, not even the high, because that doesn't really happen anymore anyway, once you're really truly addicted, but the sensory features, they're just on your radar, right? And if it's true that you're reducing the whole world to like, I either have a cigarette or I don't, you're kind of artificially decreasing instrumental divergence, because all of these actions that have these distinct and salient sensory specific outcomes don't have those to you anymore, right? They all just don't produce the drug. And then this small set of actions do produce the drug. And so if we compute it, if we reduce the kind of outcome axis, that random variable, to just those two states, we would severely reduce instrumental divergence. And I think just anecdotally, based on my own experience, that something like that might be going on in addiction. Let's do one more thing before we finish. This is kind of funny. I feel like I have to do this at every talk now, which is annoying. It turns out that, let's say 10 years before I started thinking about instrumental divergence, this computer scientist was like doing it. And he called it empowerment. His name was Daniel Polanyi. I haven't met him yet. I found this out last year because someone tried to put us on the same panel. So I was like, let me check this guy out. Oh my God, it's my stuff. And usually that would be super annoying. It's like, that's my stuff. But I'm not a computer scientist. And so we have, even though we're actually talking about the exact same thing, we're defining it mathematically the same. He's using mutual information, but as I told you, that's the same. There's one caveat where he assumes a distribution over the action variable that maximizes instrumental divergence, which I don't, again, because I'm not trying to create a situation. I'm trying to see what people are doing. So I don't make assumptions about the distributions over actions, but otherwise it's pretty much the same. His point was also that, all else being equal, try to maximize the amount of flexible control. He uses these maces where, so this is actually a maze. You can't see the cells in that one, but there are walls. And so here he's plotting the opposite of instrumental divergence or empowerment. So it's just showing that there's some places where you're trapped and you don't really have any flexible instrumental control. Now I'm not, as I said, a computer scientist, but I hired one to help me do some of this stuff. And we don't know if Polanyi already did this, but the first thing we wanted to show, so we copied this two-step empowerment grid, and we wanted to show that it is in fact reward maximizing. So here we're showing that, yes, all else being equal, maximize instrumental divergence because it scales with reward maximization. So it could be used as an optimization criterion in that sense. Another thing we're doing that I know Polanyi hasn't done is, remember this experiment I told you about where people have a high or low divergence condition? The goal of this experiment really was to show that when you have zero divergence, you shouldn't be goal directed, right? For the reasons I just talked about. If there's zero divergence, your actions, all your actions produce the same outcome state, then don't spend all this computational cost figuring out like, what's the probability? What's the transition matrix? What's the utility? Don't do any of that because it's not going to get you anything. And we showed in that experiment that people were, this is devaluation insensitive, that people were more insensitive to devaluation in that zero divergence condition. So this is just a general principle though, that optimal behavior really shouldn't involve goal directedness in zero divergence environment because you don't get that return of flexible control for making those computations. So we're implementing this in kind of a factory test bed, which is popular in AI. The agent is a manager. He has to activate or deactivate workers. Each crew has like a different level of divergence, which is related to their specialization. If they all have the same specialization, there's zero divergence. And then the divergence, instrumental divergence for the manager increases with the differentiation in the specialization of the workers because the manager gets information about a quota that has to be filled. Now he could just randomly activate a bunch of workers. And if all workers have the same specialization, then that's what he should do. He shouldn't sit around and say, well, this guy does this and this guy does this and try to work it out, because in the end, anybody will have, activating any worker will have the same effect on the quota. So this is kind of a cost, benefit analysis in terms of the planning cost of being goal directed or model based as we do with reinforcement learning. And the extent to which you can achieve your goals. That's the difference from the desired quota to the actual quota. And those should kind of cross over as you go from high to zero instrumental divergence. This is our cost function. I don't have, this guy Jack sent me a graph, but honestly had like drawn it because that's how they do stuff. And I was like, nah, it's proof of concept. You can see how this has to be true in the limit. And we're kind of interested in how it's scaling. In general, going forward, so this is all kind of a bit of future work, but the broad objective going forward is to think about this preference that we've demonstrated now reliably, robustly, this preference for environments with greater instrumental divergence. Think of that, you can construe that as a representational preference over features that maximize divergence, meaning that you should represent states and actions in a way that maximizes instrumental control. So there are lots of ways to test this experimentally. One of the experiments that I'm working on right now, I just have people like generate random 3-press sequences, and then I can control on the fly the instrumental divergence by mapping maybe a lot of sequences to a single outcome. So that's low instrumental divergence, some of them to unique outcomes, and so on and so forth. And then testing kind of how do people represent these actions? How do they communicate these actions to other people? Another thing, because again, it's not just your actions, but if you have a set number of actions that you can change, you can maybe change the environment, change the way you represent the state space. So here we have, stimuli that vary along multiple dimensions, and one dimension is associated with maximal instrumental divergence. We expect that to be the dimension along which people represent these stimuli, right? Certainly, we're going to put people in the scanner and, see if we can mess around a little bit with the right supramarginal gyrus. And there's no shortage of algorithms for doing this kind of feature selection and extraction, both in deep learning and in machine learning. So we'll get to that. But really, I'm a psychologist. It always starts with behavioral experiments for me. And what I'm looking to do right now is really try to show that instrumental divergence can be a general principle of representational organization. And on that lofty note, I'm going to let you guys go. I want to thank the hardworking students in my lab, NSF for funding the research, and you for coming to the talk. Thank you.